We'll start with some housekeeping. How did you all find the homework questions and the reading? Was everything all right?
Yeah, I had a question on, I think it was the first question in the homework. I had it listed last. And
Okay.
I know, I think Brooke took that. Did you take that one? So I was kind of interested in here, but
Mhm.
I guess I don't remember exactly how you explained that. So I wanted to hear that again.
Well, that's worth going over. So let me pull that up. I think you did email me that. So, all right. So that last question was briefly evaluate the claim that space, time, and matter and not light are the content of creation for day one. How does this affect the gap theory? So this question essentially stems from um, some, I guess you'll see charts that are made for kids so that they'll know what the creations on each day were. And usually they put on day one light. Light was the first creation because light is mentioned. It's one of those things that God called forth. But he didn't call it forth as a creation. He uses none of the creative terms. He just says, let there be, and it's revealed. Whereas everything else, he says, let it be, and it's either made or formed. And this is one thing where we do see artificial light coming into the created universe on day four. But it appears that until God created uh, those light makers, the sun and, well, phenomenologically, the moon, it doesn't create its own light, but from our perspective, it looks like it does. It reflects light back to us. But we could even say that the sun doesn't really have its own light. Its light is sourced in God because he's the creator of it. But day one doesn't have anything created that produces light, and light itself is not created. Light itself is from the nature of God. So what we have is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's creation for day one, heavens and the earth. And he reveals his creation with his own presence, which is light, which we understand from 1 John 1:5. Of course, there it's used to teach us something about his holiness and his perfection. But the characteristic of him as being light is both a physical and a non-physical quality. When uh, light essentially does reveal things, and that is something about God's character. And so, when He creates something physical and He manifests Himself physically, that physical manifestation is going to reveal what is around Him, and so that is the character and nature of light. So, light can't really be our first day creation because artificial light is our fourth day creation, and God is the revealer of His creation on day one. And so, what this does to the gap theory is it makes it impossible to put any space between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, because right there you've got the creation of day one then split away from day one. Uh, if there is no creation of space, time, and matter from verse 1 on day one, then you don't actually have anything created on day one. It's just the creator making visible the destroyed earth. And so when we recognize that light isn't the creation of day one, we are forced to look back to verse 1 for what was created. And then it draws those verses closer together. And textually, we have to see that um, there's not really room for a gap between those two verses. So I would say that was the intent of that question, was to see, or was to show that uh, that what was truly created was the heavens, the earth, the entire universe. It's the initial creation. And an interesting thing about that we pulled out was that um, the universe basically exists as a trinity. And if either one of those elements of the trinity is removed, you don't have anything. If you don't have time, you have no time for space and matter to exist. It can't exist. There's nowhere for it to exist. You don't have space, you have no place for time to occur, and you have no place for matter to exist. You don't have matter, you have nothing to populate space and nothing to act within time. So you really need all three together, and they form a trinity God once again placing his fingerprint on his creation and showing these three co-equal but dependent parts. None of them are part of or a piece of the other. They all exist perfectly, but perfectly complete together. So I would say that's one way that God has revealed himself in nature. So again, there we have general revelation explained to us through special revelation. What we can see and observe through empirical evidence is attested to and explained through Scripture, through God's direct revelation. Okay, how do you guys feel about that question now? I know some of these questions are very dependent on the lecture material more than the reading material. So hopefully that's allowing you to still be able to research these questions, all right? How do you feel so far generally about the questions? Because remember, these are the questions I'm going to be drawing from for the midterm.
I feel good about them. That one was one I struggled with a little more.
Okay. And what about in the feedback? Are you guys getting what you need from the feedback?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I've been having a lot of trouble with the formatting. I
Okay.
don't have a computer,
Okay.
so I just use my iPad, which is completely incompatible with anything Word related. So when I try to like export it as a docs, it doesn't keep the formatting.
Okay.
It messes it all up, but I can export it as a PDF
Okay.
and have it keep the formatting.
If you want to send me a Pages document instead of Word, that would be fine. The reason I specified Word was because I don't want a PDF, because I want to be able to edit or type in or place comments into the text for you guys. And then I want to make it easier for you to go in and edit that document so that you can improve on what was written. So an editable document, either Pages or Word, would either be fine.
Could I just share the Google Docs with you?
That's also fine. Yeah.
Okay, that'd be the easiest one for me.
Yep.
And the one that would make my iPad the least.
No worries. Yeah. As long as I can type into the document comments, that's all I need.
All right, thanks. I'll be getting a computer at some point when I can afford it. I just can't right now.
Understood. Yes. No, and I was overly specific in the instructions and everything so that there wouldn't be too many questions. But of course, whenever you're overly specific, you think it's too much of a pigeonhole, I guess. So know that I am flexible on these things, but I specified things so that there would be fewer, like, well, do I do this or this or this or this? Just to have one way, and if you need to deviate off of that, just let me know and we'll work around it.
Yeah. And it's fine formatting it in Google Docs. It's just when I try to export it, it like scrunches it all up into like one page that's not even full 8.5 by 11. And I don't know how to get it to not do that.
That's okay. Well, and I will say that the documents that you forwarded to me so far have been perfectly acceptable.
Okay.
So whatever you've been doing is fine. If you need to change that a bit to make it a little easier on you, I don't want the creating of the document to be the hardest part of your homework.
All right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Well, how about the reading for this week? Were you guys able to get through it?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. I think this was our lightest week in reading, if I recall. But again, I would say these aren't as challenging of topics as the last one we went through, the dichotomous or trichotomous parts of man. But it can be a little conceptually challenging, I'd say, especially the debate over the image and the likeness. Are they the same? Are they mirrors of each other? Are they shadows of similarity here? Those debates can get kind of intertwined, but they're not really the level of understanding we're going for in this class. This is a Bible college level, not master seminary level. So don't feel like you have to grasp all that material. Some of the debates, again, they're convoluted. But if you can just kind of get an understanding that there is some question of whether these are the same or different, that's really all we're going for. But we will dig in a bit more. All right. Any questions then on the reading overall so far? Have you been able to dive into both resources, or just Fruchtenbaum, or just Schaeffer?
I've been able to hit both.
You've done both?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, you will get different flavors from both. Arnold, as you will have noticed from this week's reading, is indeed a Calvinist. So he will state some things that are a little like, I don't think I'd phrase it that way, or I just simply disagree with him on this. And here's a short list of reasons why. Again, don't be frightened if you disagree with him. He's not the scriptural authority on these issues, but it's good to deal with all of the different views that might come up, especially in popular theology, because you'll be confronted by those not only in grace circles or dispensational circles, but in Christendom generally. In fact, Calvinism is probably the most popular Protestant flavor, so you're likely to encounter it quite frequently. All right. Well, if there's no more housekeeping that we should take care of, then let's move on to a bit of a discussion on image and likeness. This is that Latin phrase, imago Dei, the image of God. And we are told right from the very beginning that we're created in God's image. Of course, in Genesis 2:7, we saw a bit more of the actual creation of man, where his material parts was made or formed from the ground, what God had already created, and then he was breathed into, the inbreathing from God the Father, and that became a living soul, that material and immaterial part of man. And now we've got this creature, but Genesis 1:26, 1:26, 27, and 28 gives us more of the purpose for man, the reason for man, and the planning for the God the Creator to create man. And whenever we see something, we call it the principle of first arrival. The first time something arrives on the scene is the most important for understanding it in the future. So we see here the very first mention of man in Genesis 1:26. That makes it very important moving forward whenever we're dealing with man. This is a passage we have to come back to, and we can look at the whole context of creation, but this was the first thing that God said about man. And it is a very important aspect then of who he is and why we're here. So Genesis 1:26 says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And then let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle of and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So we really have two statements. In the Hebrew they used, I think it's jussive and something else. They are basically imperative forms, but one includes the speaker and one excludes the speaker. So let us is including the speaker. This is a command within the Godhead. This is our plan. This is our purpose. We're going to do this. And then we've got a let them, which is a third person command. So both of these forms are not really what you'd usually see in an imperative or a command, where you get a second person, either singular or plural, and you've got the first person telling them what to do. You've got both sides of the scale here without ever hitting an actual second person imperative of God, first person, speaking to man, the second person, saying, do this. Instead, you have first person commanding himself, and then speaking of the third, what they will have him do. So he says, let us make man. This is God's plan. how he will affect it, and then the purpose for man that God has in creating them to let them rule. So he says that man will be made in our image and according to our likeness. The big debate in the Imago Dei is there something different between God's image and God's likeness? Now, you've read about this in the Fruchtenbaum reading and in the Schaeffer reading, so we won't beat it to death. I'll just give you my assessment of the text here. My assessment of the text here is that Moses is layering on meaning by quoting God's intentions and stated purpose. He is refining the point. As I think Schaeffer pointed out best, or no, Fruchtenbaum pointed out best, image is the one that continually is used over and over again. Likeness is seldom used. I think it's used twice in Scripture to define man's being created in the image of God. And that does, I think, show us a bit of what's going on here. Is the image of God is a bit broader of a topic, and so God refines it by adding on likeness. It's not just his image, but generally it's not a distant shadow or reflection of man or of God, but it's also not going to be his exact copy or replica. He's not creating another divine being. He's not creating another God. But he is creating something in the form and in the similarity to him that's going to share certain characteristics, but to a limited degree. So it's not an exact replica, it's just his likeness, but this likeness is in the image of God. And so I would say likeness is actually defining image and telling us what image is, and then image is going to be used later on freely, because in the principle of first arrival, image is defined by his likeness. This is the, if image has a big domain of meaning, we have to select only that domain of meaning that coheres with this term likeness also. And so if you put them on a Venn diagram, it's where these two words overlap. That's how man was made in the image of God. And why I think this is true is because in the next statement, he goes on to define what it will look like for man to be made in God's image. And the very first characteristic that he pulls out is authority. He is pulling out his own rule over the universe, and this creature that he's now made in his image, he is establishing as the ruler of this microcosm of the universe. He is to rule specifically over the domains surrounding this earth, the sea, the sky, and the land. And he's to rule over those things which God has populated it with: the fish, the birds, the cattle, the creeping things on the earth. All of those things come under man's rulership because they're in the image of God. And so we've got the image of God, and then two different definitions of what that is. One clarifies or shrinks the meaning down so it can be vague into this likeness. And then we get an explanation. One of many explanations to come. But again, since this is the first definition here of what it means to be made in God's image or his likeness, this kind of reigns supreme, and this was God's ultimate goal and purpose for mankind, is to rule. So the other things and the similarities that we'll see constituting man that correlate with God's likeness are going to be aids to this end. We are in this image so that we can rule, and all of those parts that we share with God and who he is enable us to do this goal or this task that he has for us. And ultimately, the result of this is going to be that God is glorified over all things. And we'll see that when we get to the end here, when we talk about the implications for the incarnation of man. But we get some more definition very quickly as we move forward into Genesis 5:1. This is the book and the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and he blessed them, and he named them man in the day when they were created. So we have Adam now created in the likeness of God, Adam and Eve both sharing those similarities. It's not just the male that was made in God's image, and it's also not just Adam, and it stops at Adam. We'll see that in a minute. It is shared with all humanity, this image of God, but it ultimately comes through the creation of man. Oh, and I will go back a little bit here. He blessed them, again, enabling them to go on and be productive. Without God's blessing, productivity is not possible, and this is not just going to be in his reproduction, but also in his labor and in his social institutions and in his fellowship with God as well. But then he names him man. God has placed his own authority over man, and then he has placed man in authority over creation. And this is the structure that man is supposed to reflect. Man is in God's image, not his own image, and he is to reflect God's image on earth. But Genesis 5:3 moves on to show the beginning of deterioration. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness. Now, this would naturally be the course from the reproduction of the body and the soul through the parents. Every child is going to be in the image of his father, but the problem is his father's image is now corrupted. Body and soul, he's fallen. His physical body is heading towards the grave, and spiritually, he has already been separated from God. And so when Seth is born, he's born in this image. This should have been a perfect reflection back to God, but since Adam changed who he is spiritually, and the result was a physical change as well, when Seth is born, Seth is now born in the image of Adam. And this is going to be true of all persons who are born after this. Ultimately, yes, we are the image of our parents directly, but ultimately stretching back, we are the image of Adam. And that gets important again when we look at the incarnation. Because this...
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So you mentioned Seth. That doesn't apply to Cain and Abel?
It does apply to Cain and Abel. In fact, we see that in Cain's activities, that his sinful inclination is reflective of Adam's fall. However, this in Genesis 5:3 is moving the story forward. So he's re-summarizing Adam, and he's picking up with Seth and moving on. And he's explaining something that's happened now to the nature and character of man. Some have picked up, especially in Genesis 6:2, with the sons of God and the daughters of man. Some who would deny that this is an angelic corruption of mankind. They'll try to find reasons why the Sethite line versus the Cainite line were in conflict with one another. And one of the arguments is that Seth, his line is in the image of God, and Cain's line was not in the image of God. This doesn't really make any sense with the text necessarily, because being in the image of Adam here is distinguished from being in the image of God directly. He shares those parts of God's image which Adam does not lose in the fall, but they're corrupted still. And so this is actually a negative statement on humanity, that we're born in the likeness of Adam, because Adam's image is marred from the perfect holiness that God had installed him with. And then no comment is made on Cain because his line wasn't the future line of the rest of humanity. And so we don't really need to know much about his anthropology, though it would be the same as Seth's, because he had both the same parents and after the fall. So it's an argument from silence that some will make, and it's not a very strong argument from silence either. So I hope that answers the question. Cain was also in the image of Adam fallen.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, the New Testament also does mention being in the image of God. It mentions it, two times at least here in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians and as well in the book of James. And these are both quoted in the Arnold Fruchtenbaum reading, but I want to get a fuller context on these for us so that we can see how Paul is using this in his argument here in Corinthians and how James uses it in his argument. Because James has a unique flavor on linguistics there as well, which we're going to talk about. 1 Corinthians 11:7 says, "For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man." Now, this is an important distinction that he's making on being in the image of something, because if you remember back to Genesis, that both man and female are in God's image. But Paul is specifically pulling out this aspect of being in someone's image, that it is originating from them. Both the male and the woman were direct creations of God, but the material that God made to use it is what is being highlighted here. And so the material that God used to make Adam was, first of all, the earth, but second of all, his own breath. And he breathed into Adam, and Adam became a living person. So Adam is from the earth, earthly, and from the heavenlies, heavenly. He makes this argument later in 1 Corinthians 15 that the part of man that's from man goes to the earth, the part of man that's from God goes back to God. So here, what we have isolated is that spiritual relationship that man has to God, being the direct creation of God. Then we have the woman having come from man, and God used the man, his material parts, to create the woman. We don't have any explanation, though, of how she got her immaterial parts. We don't have another statement of God breathing into her separately. And I don't think we have that historically either. We have God using the material parts of man and the immaterial parts of the man to form the woman, so that all of humanity, including Eve, is in the image of the federal or seminal head of the human race. If Eve is excluded in any part from that, she's excluded from the replacement of the first Adam in the last Adam. And she doesn't share the redemption of the soul that Adam would have looking forward in Christ. And so the woman comes from the man in the same way that the man comes from God in his immaterial and material parts. And so this becomes then a chain of authority. God has installed authority into the man, especially emphasized after the fall. Beforehand, it would have looked far more conducive to one another, just as man's working together with God was a fellowship and a harmony before, that would have looked surprisingly, I think, more equal than we have it today. When we look forward into restored creation, we do still retain that authority and headship of Christ, and we always will. And that authority and headship is a perfect and good thing, but we look at it sometimes today as oppressive. It's not. It is simply a chain of authority and responsibility. But our work together with Christ in the future, in the kingdom, in the eternal state, is going to be far more intimate. And this authority structure was far more intimate, I think, before the fall, and it was marred by the fall. We see this, and we'll look at this when we get to the fall, in both God's statements towards the man and God's statements towards the woman, where one thing that sin introduced into this social structure between the man and the woman created was separation, not just of themselves from God, but of themselves from one another in perfect harmony. And so even before the fall, we did have this authority. God rules through the man over the woman, and the man and the woman together over creation. And so this is reflected here in 1 Corinthians 11:7. The man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. This man he's specifically speaking of is going back to Adam. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for man's sake, as a co-ruler. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. He's already made an explanation that the angels are watching our interactions to learn. However, in the Lord, neither is the woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. In the Lord, these two become one flesh, and they're not separable anymore. For as the woman originates from the man, so also man has birth through the woman. So now we see how God has tied all of humanity up together, so that although the first woman came from man, all men forward from that come from a woman. But all things originate from God, and they originate from God, that original inbreathing through Adam. And this is how we get a single race where there's no distinctions in for redemptive purposes. All right. Did I get to all that? Yeah, all things originating from God.
I have another question.
Yes, sir.
For say somebody that's just starting to read the Bible,
Mhm.
is reading Genesis, why did the author, in this case Moses, why did he use the word image when most people interpret image as a physical thing and not a spiritual thing that obviously God is?
Uh, I would say it has New Testament implications as well, and it's God looking forward into his plans for creating man. I do think it has a physical aspect to it, in that God is a non physical being, but he is creating something physical that's analogous to his being. And so that physical creature has to reflect those immaterial parts as well. Characteristics, because ultimately God, who is spirit, is going to place himself into this image also. Some other uses of that word image in the Old Testament are in idols, where idols are images, but the purpose of using that word for those is that these are physical representations of something unseen or some invisible reality. So they'll worship angels and demons and such, and they will create a physical representation of it that they can worship. And I think it's the prophet Isaiah as well as Ezekiel. They make the they draw the line between what these images are. Is nothing like the God that we worship and that we serve, because these are dead idols. They're just an image. There's no truth or reality in them. They don't speak, they don't eat, they don't think, they don't talk. None of this. But then when God creates something in his own image, it does think, speak, talk, breathe. It does all these things that God's doing, just in a finite sense, and God does them in an infinite sense. And God has the source in himself, where man has his source in God. And so the use of image, I do think, is carefully planned here. Then when you move forward into the New Testament, and you see, for example, in the book of Hebrews, where Christ is the exact, or Colossians, Christ is the exact representation of God. It is using that term, image. He's the exact image, this physical representation of God. He is the promised manifestation of God's presence on earth among his people, the restoration of fellowship. So I think it looks forward to the incarnate Christ, who would take on that image and become physical together with his creation. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the point here in 1 Corinthians 11:7 was to see that this image of God, having its source in God and reflecting back God, it's paired together with the glory. So since he is the image and glory of God, God, in creating man in his image, the goal and purpose was for man to glorify him on earth, and to glorify him through reflecting his own personhood, his own personality, his own nature and character to the rest of creation, and in the witness of the angels. The angels would also bear witness and testimony to the glory of God, and they would do that in watching God's interaction with man on earth. So in James, James chapter 3 is James talks about how to use the tongue, the dangers of the tongue, and the destructive nature that the tongue can be when it's unbridled or detached from reality as God interprets and has it, or detached from the morality that God calibrates in our conscience through His Word. And so the tongue can be a very dangerous thing. He uses the example of a rudder on a boat, where it's a tiny little piece that keeps the boat, but it keeps the boat turned in the direction it should go. And so the tongue, being a small organ, still has this great effect on the body and the life of the person. So in James 3:5, he says, "So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among other members as that which defiles the entire body, and sets on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell. For every species of beasts and birds and reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison." And in verse 9, "With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God." I think this, in James' argument here, serves as kind of um, I guess, a biblical way of saying, do you kiss your mother with that mouth? Uh, James here is saying, you guys are blessing the Lord, but then you're turning and you're devouring each other with your words. Rather, your words should reflect the words that God has revealed through His Word. And this is ultimately what the result of sanctification looks like. And sanctification is a big issue in the book of James. But notice here it's the image, or the likeness of God that man has been made in. And the issue is that man is blessing God, but he is cursing the image of God. The image of God in man through their likeness. But notice the correlation that he makes. Man is dominant over the earth, the species within the earth. God had originally placed them, and we see that man has used his tongue, used this faculty of language that God gave him to establish authority over the earth as God had told him to do. So we see man in one case using the tongue as he should, but in another case turning back towards God and denying God the glory for this position that man has been placed on in this earth. And this is reprehensible in James' argument and in reality. So on that note, then, we have man in the image of God being cursed by other men, and that this is worthy of reproach. In Genesis 9, we see a very similar thing. We have the derogation of man and his immaterial part, his nature and who he is, being derided by another person. Here we have the actual physical representation of God manifest on earth, humans with authority to represent God, being destroyed by men and by beasts. Genesis 9:1-2, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the sky, everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hands they are given." So interestingly enough, after the flood, when God reestablishes the creation here, He's used man to preserve and rescue creation. Again, looking at God using man to do the work of God on earth. God originally created man, or created animals, created the vegetation. Then he tells man, rule over them and cultivate them. Take my work and continue to reflect this by reproducing this work. God also, before judgment, is bringing salvation, and he tells man, be a part of doing the rescuing of these creatures. Be a part of that activity, because this is God's activity of rescuing. And so he's bringing man in on that activity of rescuing. And then after the flood, when he places man back on the earth and he reestablishes man's authority over these animals and creatures, he actually elevates this authority that he's going to be having because of the continued deterioration of the creation. And so God is placing in the hearts of these creatures now fear and terror, or rather a natural respect for man. And this is important because rather than simply being animal husbands or animal protectors, we now become animal predators as well. And so there's not going to be this harmony in the creation that God initially created, such as we'll see looking forward into the millennial kingdom, where we'll have children playing with these animals and such. This peace that exists between mankind is marred by sin, but of a necessity as well. In Genesis 9:3, we see, every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give it all to you as I gave the green plant, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So all of these animals that move, that have blood, are now given to man as food, but man's not to eat the blood, because blood is the physical representation of the immaterial life that exists in these creatures. And there's good reason for this as the representation and reflection of life, not just that it needs to keep air flowing through the body in order for the body to have life, but blood literally carries breath through the whole body because it packages that oxygen and carries it throughout. So it transports God's initial inbreathing essentially to all parts of the physical body. And so this naturally represents life. Man is allowed to consume the material part, but he is not to consume the immaterial part, essentially, and that immaterial part is represented by the material physical part of the blood. But then he continues here, and we see the implication of man being in God's image. And notice also that man is still in God's image despite the fall. Genesis 9:5, surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. From every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, being beast or animal, by man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. The man represents God, the image of God on earth, and an offense against this image is an offense against God directly. Despite man's fallen nature, despite man's corrupted personhood, man still represents, reflects, and as we see in this Genesis 9 passage, has the responsibilities given to him by God over the creation. Despite the fall that was caused by man, he still has responsibility. We see God do stuff like this all the time, where man does not deserve the position that God has given him, but God has given it to him, and he will use him for it. One example is in Genesis 20. We have the incident between Abimelech and Abraham. God has put Abraham in a unique covenant with himself, where he is responsible to be like God to the nations as a representative of the nations. God represents himself to creation and represents creation back to himself through the mediator or the mediatorial position of man. And he represents the nations to himself and himself to the nations through the nation of Israel, which he created through Abraham. And he represents himself to the nation of Israel and the nation of Israel to himself through the mediatorship of the priests and the prophets. God always places a mediator between himself and someone else. And we have today our ultimate mediator, Christ. He is the perfect mediator and the only mediator now between the individual and God. And that is because he is able to represent God to man, being fully divine, and man to God, being fully man. He is the perfect mediator. But with Abimelech and Abraham, we have Abraham being the cause of Abimelech's sin, because Abraham concealed the truth from him, lied about his wife Sarah, and said that she is his sister. Sarah, the wife, agreed with Abraham's lie and testimony and told Abimelech also that she was his sister and not his wife. So he has the testimony of two witnesses, but unfortunately both these witnesses are corrupt in their testimony. And so when God comes to Abimelech and tells him, I'm going to kill you because you've sinned against me in this way, restore the woman to her husband, and have Abraham pray for you, and I will spare your life. We see Abraham caused the death and destruction that is coming on Abimelech, and yet Abimelech still has his mediatorship to God through Abraham. We have a very similar thing with fallen man on earth today, and ever since the fall, where man is the cause of the fall, man is the cause of death and destruction on this earth, man is the cause of the deterioration in the animal kingdom, and all of this through the original sin. But man is still responsible to rule over it. Man is still responsible as its mediator. And it's still responsible to reflect God on this earth towards the animal kingdom or the lower elements, because God has installed his own image into man. And this image itself deserves that sort of authority and recognition within creation. It's not anything meritorious of ourselves, but meritorious of God who created us. Okay, so with all of that said on the image and likeness of God, it's important to recognize that there are both similarities and dissimilarities between us and God. One natural one is the possibility of sinning. It is possible for man to sin. It is not possible for God to sin. It is completely inconceivable for him to do such a thing. But there are also things that we are bound to by being bound to his nature and his image. So we want to, right off the bat here, make this important distinction we call the creator-creature distinction. Here's just a visual representation of it, where we've got the creator on one plane of being, and we've got the creature or the created thing on another plane of being. By nature of the fact that creation has been created, it cannot be equal to God. God is the uncaused cause of the universe. The universe was caused by God. God is an uncreated being, and everything that has been created through him. And so we have this right off the bat, insurmountable difference, impassable gulf between God and his creation. No matter what he creates, it will not be God, because God is created by nothing and has nothing preceding his own existence. There has never been a time in history in which God does not exist, and there will never be a time in the future in which God does not exist. And so, any created being cannot reach the level of godhood. Satan himself has sought to elevate himself to the very throne of God, or above the throne of God. But Satan, by nature of being a created being, cannot achieve this end, cannot achieve this goal, because he has his source in God as well. And so this creator-creature distinction is a very important aspect to our universe, that God the Creator exists completely outside of it, because it has been created and he has not. Now, when you drop down into the level of creation, we have this yellow box instead. inside the black box, where we've got a distinction between man and animals in nature. Now, there are also distinctions between animals and nature, where nature being the vegetation and domain in which it exists. The animals use both the land, the sea, and the air, and the food that's in it. But ultimately, man represents God to the animals and the nature, this microcosm of creation, in the same way that God himself is ruler over all of creation. And so, although man has been placed in an analogous position over aspects of the created universe, he himself cannot extend his own rule outside of where he's been placed, and certainly not outside of creation itself. Man cannot rule over the universe like God rules over the universe. God needs to be an uncreated being in order to do that, and man is a created being. This is a distinction even God cannot do anything about. He cannot make it so that man was not created, because then man would not exist. In order for God to exist, God has to create him. So are there any questions on any of this at this point? No? Okay, because we're about to switch to a different slideshow, I think. Are we? No, not quite. Yeah, we'll switch to a different slideshow. Actually, it's a document. And then I'll do this. Shared window. Okay, can you all see this document?
Yes.
All right, this is part of your reading for next week, but it's one that you're just going to be glancing over, and it's going to feed into next week's conversation as well on the social nature of mankind. But we recognize that man has been uniquely designed by God. So when God created the world, he created it perfect in his design. Mankind, both male and female, were made in God's image. We understand hopefully better what this means. We are to reflect God as an image reflects the thing that it is created or designed to look like, to the physical world. And the primary means of that occurring is through authority. What does being created in God's image mean? Simply put, it means that man shares some of God's attributes, but in man, these attributes are finite or limited when compared with God. So, just as we saw there, where man has we wouldn't say deficit, it is a deficit of having been created, so he cannot become like God. We see that God, in creating man in his own image, created something that could not be finite moving forward. So God created in the immaterial part of man something eternal, but eternal in a different way than God is eternal. God is eternal because he always has existed and always will exist. Man is eternal because he has a point in time in which he began to exist, and from that time forward, he will always exist. God created eternal souls, and he is even going to pair them with eternal bodies. In Romans 8, he explains how he subjected this creation to destruction so that this creation could be vindicated, essentially. We can look at that later. And that would be part of this creation, the bodies that we possess now. He's subjected to futility, basically so that our souls could be rescued from these now corrupt bodies, and he would replace them with glorified bodies. These glorified bodies are eternal bodies that will continue to exist for as long as our souls exist, which is forever. But on the other hand of the other side of the coin, we have the eternal bodies given to those who are not inheritors of eternal life because they've never trusted in Christ and his gift of eternal life. They also receive eternal bodies to go along with their eternal souls. You see that their souls are not destroyed because the soul is where we reflect that image of God and the nature of God as it has been placed in us. And so it cannot cease to be. because God himself does not cease to be. So that is one, and I think one of the major examples of what God is, and we are like God, but infinite beings as creatures, not the creator. Here are some other examples in this reading from the Interlocked series. We have God being all loving. His love is perfect and is not dependent on the object of love being good or not. In contrast, man has the ability to love, but it is not perfect love. Man's love often depends on words, actions, behaviors, and choices of the object of love. Now, what we have here then is impersonal love versus personal love. God's love by nature is impersonal, and that doesn't mean that it's cold and not really loving. What it means is it does not depend on the person being loved or the object being loved. Rather, it depends on the nature and character of the person doing the loving. God being perfect in his nature and perfect love himself does not require a perfect object to receive love or to give that love to that object. Whereas man, left to his own devices apart from God, can only muster love that depends on the object being loved and its attractiveness to him. This is personal love, love that depends on the person. So God, a good example of this would be Romans 5, where, how did that go? God loved us while we were yet sinners, or while we were yet enemies. And 1 John 4:17, God died for us, and in that he showed us his love. So we see that God is perfectly loving, lacking in absolutely nothing, totally self-sufficient in his own being to pour love out on another object. Man is deficient in his own being, yet still capable of reflecting God's love towards others. However, man is only able to have this gap bridged between his own natural personal love and God's impersonal love when he has God's love flowing through him, made perfect or made complete. That's a major theme in the Epistle of 1 John. God's love made complete results in impersonal love in man. Because man has been created in the image of God, he is capable of loving like God when God's love is flowing through him, unimpeded by his own contrary will or volition. Or better said, when man has been sanctified by the word of God and it is working and flowing through him, and he understands the love of God towards him, the love of God towards him is able to flow through towards other, and it becomes impersonal love. God is all-knowing, meaning that he has perfect knowledge in himself, and he needs nothing else in order to have this perfect knowledge. We've talked about this briefly, or rather we've touched on this concept when we discussed special revelation, because we've got general revelation, the world that God has created, the observations that we can make, and we've got the organs and the faculties to observe this nature, rather better the instruments, both organic and inorganic, that we're able to create, to observe, but only God knows perfectly. And so whatever he reveals to us, whatever he says to us, he has no deficit of knowledge in speaking on this issue or these issues. So when God knows something, he knows it perfectly, without error, and completely. He's never lacking in knowledge. However, man knows things, but his knowledge is imperfect. First, man has to learn things. This is something that God does not need. God does not need to learn because he does not know something and needs to come to know it. Angels, however, we see, do need to learn. Angels are also not omniscient, is the big, scary technical word for this. Angels are not omniscient. God alone is omniscient, lacking in no knowledge, being the ultimate source of reality and truth. He knows it perfectly. In contrast, man has knowledge, but man's knowledge is incomplete, imperfect, and must be learned. When we come to know something, we won't know all aspects of that thing. We have to learn little by little, understanding implications, understanding um, all such things. Our knowledge is limited. However, we can know true things. This is something that is reflective of God. This is something that even when we look out into the animal kingdom, they don't have a concept of truth and lies. They might understand, you tricked me, you tended to throw the ball, and then you never threw the ball. But this isn't a knowledge of, or this isn't a knowledge of truth. This is a response to not receiving the expected outcome. Okay, moving on here. God can do anything, but God can do anything compatible with his character. He never tires and he never needs anything. In contrast, mankind, through effort, can do some things, but man gets exhausted and needs food, water, and rest. So, when we look at God putting man in charge of this creation to reflect his own will, and to reflect his own activities on earth, he gives man tasks to do, like cultivating the garden, like reproducing humanity and child rearing and families. Man is ultimately going to exhaust, need, depend. He's going to need water. He's going to need rest. Even in the new heavens and new earth, we see that man still represents finitely what God is infinitely, because man still needs to depend on sustenance from God, and he'll depend on the tree of life, once again, in the eternal state with God. And so, once again, God does not create little gods. God does not create self-sufficient, self-sustaining beings, but beings that are sustained perfectly on him. So God can do anything inside his character. We'll look at that a little bit more before we take our break. There are things that God cannot do, but this is not a lack or a deficiency in his being. In fact, being able to do these things, as we would use our English language to say, is actually not an ability but a deficit. But last here in this list, God is holy, the creator of everything. God is the ultimate authority on right and wrong. In himself, he expresses what is right and does what is right all the time. In contrast, man has a conscience, the internal ability to tell right from wrong. But unlike God's holiness, man is a created being whose conscience needs to be anchored to an external authority, that is God. And when that external authority is ignored, then man's conscience will cease to work properly. I like to speak of this as man's conscience needing calibrating, because you calibrate to an ultimate standard. There's various weights and measurements that all have a standard. Usually they're kept under lock and key. I think some of them are kept in Europe, most of our weights and measurements. And the tools that we use, like a ruler or like weights that we'd use to see how many grams something weighs, those are all calibrated to the ultimate standard. That standard defines what that truth is. God is that ultimate standard, and he reveals that standard to us in his will, and our consciences depend on being established to that standard. And so this is why God's word is the means by which we are sanctified, because God's word is where the standard of calibration for our conscience exists. Without it, it's like saying we've lost our standards for measurement. We have lost our standards for measurement for good and evil, because God is that standard. Holiness speaks of separation or being set apart specifically to God and the things of God. And that means being calibrated, set to those things of God, in distinction to false things that are not correctly calibrated. So being holy means separating ourselves to this calibrating standard and away from the world's calibrating standard. Arnold, does a good job in his book, so we won't go into it too much, of discussing the original creature holiness, or unconfirmed creature holiness, where Adam was holy when he was created by God. He was calibrated to God's standard. He was he lived up to God's expectations at that point. However, his holiness wasn't inherent holiness. It wasn't confirmed holiness. It was reflective holiness that was unchallenged at that point, and so unconfirmed. Part of the nature of God that we share, that God has instilled in us, is free will, freedom of choice, or as Arnold terms it, free moral agency. And that means that man's calibration must be tested in order to be confirmed. A way of stating this graphically is God has his standard and he's got the measuring tool of man's conscience, but he's taken the safeties off of that calibrating tool. Man should leave it as it is, calibrated to God's word. He should always test it against God's word, but he has the ability to change the scale. And he does that when he separates himself from God's standard and applies a different standard. Romans, that's a major theme in Romans. We might look at that if we have a second after the break, but we're coming up on that break soon here. Let's look here at this picture before we move forward, just to graphically represent what we just looked at. In this creator-creature distinction, we have that impassable distinction. We have on the first level the creator, and on the second level the creature, specifically man. Where God is infinite, man is finite. Man has an eternal future, but a finite past. God is infinite in both directions. God is all-loving, lacking in no love either in himself or towards others, and man's love is limited. Without God, it's limited to only that which is attractive to him, and with God, it is limited to God's love. We cannot love outside of God's love. When we do, we're actually separating ourselves from God's love, and we're no longer loving perfectly. In fact, we're reverting back to our limited creature love. And so it's to love evil is something that man can do, but not through God's love, if that makes sense. God is all-knowing, lacking in absolutely no knowledge or variation of that the thing that is known. However, man's knowledge is incomplete, imperfect, and this is both in knowledge and understanding, which is slightly different. But even with God, God can bridge that gap, but man is never going to be omniscient, meaning knowing things on his own without God. God knows even without man. Man cannot know without God. God is all-powerful, able to do all things that he is sufficient to do. Anything that he can't do is not because he's insufficient to do that, but rather it is insufficient for him to do. So man, however, is limited in his ability both to do good and to do evil. Man cannot extend his own abilities outside of his own body, soul, and spirit to do certain evil things. Man is not capable of the evil that Satan is capable, because Satan is a far more powerful creature, created being, than man is. But man is still capable of extreme evil. God is incapable of extreme evil because it would be a deficiency of him to do evil. And then finally, holiness. God is the perfect standard. His conscience his conscience must be tied to the Creator or calibrated to the Creator. Okay, just as an example of what God can and can't do, this is why I wanted to get to this, because I want to ask this question. If you say your God can do anything, does it mean your God can lie? Is God incapable of lying? What do you guys think before reading it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, Are any of you guys taking apologetics?
Yes, we all are.
You are, Laura? Okay. Have you had any units on something like this? If your God says he can't lie, how do you know he actually can't lie?
We haven't yet. We've mostly just been talking about truth.
Okay. Okay,
So-
well, that's good. You've been talking about truth. Here's a very applicable apologetic question that you might ask. How do you know that God is not lying to you in his scriptures? How do you know that God's not making it up? Well, if we know anything about the nature of God, we know that God is all powerful, but what else do we know about God? Because we don't know that in a vacuum. We don't know that God is all powerful and we know nothing else about him. We also know that he is holy. We also know that he is all-knowing. So in other words, God is the calibrating standard, and he is completely knowing. He knows all things. So if he knows truth perfectly, he is the standard calibrator of truth, then to lie would be a lack in knowledge, a lack in his holiness, in the same way, or and in a more clear way of putting it, it would be a lack of truth, not an ability to lie. So man is finite in his knowledge. He knows a limited amount of truth. He understands that limited amount of truth even less. And when he runs out of truth, the response is to lie. Now you can conceal truth and lie about it, and that is a lack of understanding. But it still demonstrates a lack of, or a lack within man, a lack of truth. God, in the same way he lacks no knowledge, the same way he lacks no holiness, the same way he lacks no power, he also lacks no truth. And so, God being all truth, while man is finitely truthful, cannot run out of truth. And so if God were to impose a lie into his speech or into even general revelation, it would show a deficit in his character, a lack of perfect truth. So, for the same way that we can say God is perfect love, but he is not perfect hate. In fact, he is not perfect hate at all. He's not hate at all. So we can say that God is perfectly truth, and he is not perfectly lie. He lacks nothing when it comes to truth, and he lacks everything when it comes to a lie. And so God is not everything good and evil. God is everything good, and he is that standard of good. Is that a clear way of explaining that? Does that help? Okay. So all of these things which God is, that he installed into man, for the purpose of reflecting him in this creation, so that he would be glorified over all things. And so man has a responsibility to apply that standard that God gives through his special revelation, or his direct verbal revelation to man about reality, about truth, about the things around him, about the responsibilities that he has to God, to fellow man, to the creation. And ultimately, he is to stand in the place of God on this earth as a mediator between the creation and God. For multiple reasons, but the one that ties in best with what we discussed last week. Man has been given the image of God, the Spirit of God, so that he can have intimate fellowship with God on a spiritual level, something that the rest of the creation does not have. The animals that we are to rule over do not have that spirit, and they cannot relate directly to God. But we share in their material being, as well as sharing with God in his spiritual being. So he has uniquely designed us for the purpose of standing as mediators in this creation, so that all of creation can be glorified through God. And the angels looking on can see God's glory in finite beings reflecting the infinite God, because God has given them the power and the ability to do so. And that power and ability cannot be separated from God. When it's separated from God, man now lacks that power and ability to reflect God. But God still holds him responsible both to his tasks and duties and to his failures.